for this final session, we're going to, which is led by Dr. Naveen Thayyil, who's Associate Professor at IIT Delhi. And Naveen's research interests are really, are across the whole domain that we've been working on over the last 2 days, particularly at the intersection of law and science and technology studies, where often these things become, structured and implemented. So it's a really critical domain. And Naveen has very kindly organized, a really great panel of speakers that I will get Naveen to introduce, if you may, as we go along. And you can also let me know if you prefer to do questions, Q&A by presenter, or if you'd like to take them all at the end. I shall leave the dynamics of the panel in your safe hands.
Thanks, Adrian. Morning all. Oh, probably afternoon in Australia, right? Yeah, it's a pleasure to co-organize this with Arjun. And the idea is to explore the state of the art in this area and to see what are the contemporary trajectories around which research is happening. And it's my pleasure to welcome Nirmala, Maya, and Arjun. I think all three of them would probably not need much introduction, but this is my role today. And yeah, so Dr. Maya Dodd is currently a director at Flame University of the Flame Center for Legislative Education and Research. And she received a PhD from Stanford, and subsequently she did a postdoc at Princeton and in JNU in India. And she has previously chaired the Center for South Asia, the Writing Center, and the Department of Humanities and Languages. Her research interests include digital humanities, South Asian studies, and issues of archiving and cultural studies. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Naveen.
Dr. Nirmala Menon is a professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Indore. She's the chair of the newly established Jayaprakash Narayan National Center of Excellence in the Humanities, and she leads the Digital Humanities and Publishing Research Group at the IIT at Indore. Professor Arjun Ghosh teaches at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Delhi, and he works in the fields of performance studies, digital humanities, and tech in society. Welcome, Nirmala and Arjun. Yeah, so what we were thinking about is to have an opening round of 5 to 7 minutes each for all the three speakers, and then we have a subsequent 5 minutes or so. And it would be great if we can have questions in the chat box. I'll collect them, and yeah, I'll just nudge the speakers to add them. Yeah, welcome all. Would Maya like to go first?
Yeah, Naveen, I'll start off. I have a deck. I think it might be a bit much, but I'll try and, be very speedy with it. I hope to pose it really as a question and kind of frame the problem that I imagine is really central to our conversation today. So that being said, let me try and share screen, and yeah. I think you can see this, no? This works.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So, in fact, I think the way I framed my understanding of how we can think about, intelligent futures is really from the point of view of what I'm imagining as a digital commons. And I think the principle that really should be considered in thinking about this is the question of access. And for that, when we think about the larger picture in India, in terms of infrastructure, etc., we see that we are seeing the beginnings really of the kind of support that should have come from the university system, but hasn't so far. So we've really been seeing a lot of other actors in the kind of practices of digital humanities, particularly in the creation of content across Indian languages, and especially in the vertical around public history. So that being said, if you look at the open access story, and I know this is a very heavy slide, but it's sort of laying out the significant state efforts at creating this access, you see a range of efforts across the university system, and also in terms of trying to get archives, etc., to be digitized and to have sort of users be able to click and, get onto them or whatever. But the fact is, this is met with very limited success, and there's a very specific reason for that. And that reason really is that there is the sort of the user is not imagined at the center of that interface. So essentially, there is this movement from analog to digital, but not keeping in mind who the users are or why would they even want to sort of use these facilities. Now, in the case of things which have a state mandate, like getting a form of identity or trying to upload your degree certificate, obviously the use case is very present. But in other terms, sort of the way communities imagine their own, how do you say, reasons for being in those spaces is something that I think they have sort of solved as their own problems. So we've seen the rise of something called community archiving, whereby there's a need to tell one's own story. There's a need to kind of present in a public way, one's own sense of history and identity. And that, in a sense, stands at odds with what higher education in India has been doing, which is sort of still just about now admitting other languages into the ecosystem. So particularly in the research ecosystem sense, there isn't a sense of a multiplicity of actors. For the fact that we're a nation of 1.4 billion plus, and rising, obviously we need a variety of actors, a variety of interfaces, and we also need to admit our multilingual, reality. So in that regard, the creation of indigenous sort of publishing, etc., has also not really happened in the university space, but it exists outside the university space. So I think this is why the sort of Western model of the laboratory has not been the way that digital humanities in India has panned out. It has really come as an upsurge of popular need and people filling their own need. I'm giving an example because obviously this is a very, very, uneven landscape and a very wide one at that, where you have government interventions, you also have crowdsourcing, and you have the kind of standard digitization of things like, Asiatic Society collections, etc. Now, I think the Australian example of what Project Trove did and what Mukurtu did as a content management system has been especially promising with the way we can imagine our own sort of entry into a digital commons via digital archiving. And I say that because the way that the publics have been engaged, particularly by Trove, where all kinds of people from all kinds of places were actively sort of editing and clicking on that site, is something that we haven't even seen with platforms like Europeana and such. So clearly, this is a great model for how to go forward. But interestingly, I think with Mukurtu also, the way in which you might have differential access and you might vary, it depending on who's asking, is something that we need to consider. So the social implications of this is something that I understand. There's sensitive populations with sensitive content sometimes, but the variety of users can be imagined through something like a Mukurtu sort of model. And in the case of, for instance, Kamra, which is a queer archive that is, housed in the National Law School in Bangalore, there is a sort of sense of using that approach. So in terms of the future of what this digital commons would look like, we would need to sort of consider different users across a very, very varied ecosystem. And the ones that have happened thus far, and I specifically point to Project Madurai, the Punjab Digital Library, and a few others. I'm sorry if they're not here, which have really benefited from crowdsourcing. They were built as volunteer efforts. They began as volunteer efforts, and they began in the languages for which the technology didn't then exist. We're talking early 2000s, really. And this was really built on the backs of, in that sense, a larger public, not a university public, but a larger public. So for those reasons, it seems as if the future of sort of digital humanities, specifically as something which would want to be more inclusive, should understand the audience that needs to be put at the center of this technology in terms of how you access, who is accessing. Hence, engagement is very critical to design. The challenge of the languages, right, which is the multilingual challenge. And really, in a sense, to understand infrastructure is having small, medium, and large, where it's not a one size fits all. And hence, to create that infrastructure means you have the university system, you have communities, and you have the public at large kind of co-creating together. So this is my sort of point about how access has to be imagined across audiences. And I hope I've been fairly speedy. So thank you.
It's great, Maya. Right on time. Can I invite Nirmala?
Okay, so want me to go second?
Yeah.
Thank you, Naveen. Thank you for this invitation. And, it's always illuminating to listen to Maya, and somehow, the transitions happen very easily with her. So I think, the concerns, by the way, I did have a presentation, but I had to I got stuck in a meeting, so I don't have the presentation with me. So I'm going to do it orally now. So what I would like to focus on, taking off from where Maya stopped, which is that while she talks about the community archives and, the participation of a larger public in creating archives and databases, my concern has been slightly, more contained, in the sense that I look at precisely the same data, so scholarly publishing, and with this opening up of languages, and hoping and assuming that in the coming years we will have not just creative writing which flourishes, but also scholarly publishing in languages other than English. Right. So if we imagine a scenario where we want our students and our researchers and our faculty to think about languages other than English, then where is the publishing infrastructure to support that, right? So we do not have a scholarly publishing infrastructure that is even comparable to the kind of creative publishing infrastructure we do have, right? So if you look at creative publishing in any language, not just in English as well as in other languages, you have presses who have really, have fine translations, printing, capital infrastructure. We do not have a complementary one for public infrastructure. And the question is that why? So in some ways, it's a very long talk that I usually have, which is that, we kind of missed the bus on university presses, and we really never kind of built upon that infrastructure. But now, we are in a age where we have to think about how do we create or begin to build a digital infrastructure for publishing that is born multilingual, right? It's not just born digital, it's also born multilingual. Now, that in the beginning, to me, would have to come through translations again. Because the higher education system, especially in the elite universities as well as in the institutions, are so focused on producing scholarship in English, that it would have to be through the way of translations. So to create a kind of a publishing infrastructure that looks at multilingual publishing as the norm, not as as an add-on, is to me the need of the hour. I don't have a perfect solution for it, except that we have to start with baby steps. And I think one of the things that we have tried to do at IIT Indore is to set up the knowledge sharing in publishing, which is a multilingual publishing platform in a consortium of university presses with Ubiquity Press. We have not, it's a very nascent project, and I would have liked to talk more about the challenges of starting a project like that. But what it is trying to do in its first publication now is to publish the first anthology of electronic literature from India. That's first volume is being published in 4 languages simultaneously. So that to me is a very small beginning. And from there, I would like to see more kind of, scholarly publishing infrastructures come up in academia, right? And what are the consequences of that? One, let me also, this is a small project I had done, but I have some data from that project. We did talk about, open access. Maya had that slide. Open access in India is a very difficult argument, because on the one hand, while we do subscribe to the philosophy of open access, it is also true that we also are home to one of the highest number of predatory journals in the world. So then, to kind of create that open access infrastructure through government funding, through DST, DBT, and other funding agencies, and then to give platforms for our faculty or our researchers to publish their work is still so minimal, right? And when I say minimal, I really want to point to you that as you know, this is a paragraph I'll just read from here, that in India, these factors are high because of India's market need, with thousands of scientists needing to get published to get a tenure and promotion. So, the publish or perish kind of culture has certainly seeped into India too, especially in the last 20 years, as many of us know. The country produces about 0.34 million researchers, full-time or equivalent, between 2015 and in between 2015 and 19, India's scholarly contribution had a growth rate of 12.5%. And I'm only looking at Scopus indexed, science indexed, and journals across the world, which makes India's share in the world's output as 5.3%, with more than 0.8 million papers. So according to Scopus data, and I mined this data in 2021, I think, that India is in the 5th position in terms of total number of scholarly publications, and 6th in the terms of OA, open access publications. So given that this is the kind of scholarly publishing that we have, I think it should shock us that we still don't have a kind of a infrastructure to support it, and that we are not having levels of peer-reviewed journals or digital publishing that kind of harnesses that publication strength, while being able to parse it for for predatory works or publications. So the fact remains that as of March 2022, the Directorate of Open Access Repositories has listed 105 repositories functioning in India, and institutionally funded agencies such as Shodhganga and InflipNet, which Maya also pointed out, National Virtual Library of India, NDIL, National Digital Library of India, have all kind of made it to that list. And yet, many of those remain really very, very primitive in terms of their data as well as their metadata. So, if you look at the discoverability and dissemination of some of those databases, you see a lot of lack. So there is not a comprehensive, and I know I'm running out of time. So, there's not a comprehensive push towards consciously creating an digital publishing infrastructure that spans both scholarly publishing and community archives as a parallel kind of process, rather than rather than kind of trying to do it all in separate silos where they're not really talking to each other. So interoperability at the scale of creating those infrastructures and creating those publishing infrastructures, to me, is, I think, the need of the hour. So I'll stop here, and then we'll take it later in our discussions.
Great. Thanks, Nirmala. We can always come back in the next round. Arjun, please.
Yeah, so, I think because of our specific location, my thoughts sort of likely to resonate with what Maya and Nirmala have put on the table. I think we are around 3 corners of a triangle, but the same triangle, really. The concern that I want to bring to the table is how to sort of bridge that distance between the need for open access, as Maya has spoken about, and the multilingual sort of publishing that platforms and that Nirmala has highlighted, is the infrastructural challenge. One of the issues is that do we have the kind of resources that we need for the Indian languages that would enable so it's a technology challenge for us to move along. Now, if we look at the broad field of the digital humanities, I mean, it's a big tent, but within that, 2 broad areas are that of archiving, that's digitization and digital transformation. And the second is that of prediction, predictive modeling, linguistic language models, etc., etc. Right, and digital analysis of texts. Now, and both of them would require language-specific resources, right? I mean, in order to move to transfer documentary records into a particular digitized record, you need to have reliable OCR models, OCR or even HDR models. And do we have that? That's a crucial question. And the challenge is so much more than many other countries, if we can say, is because India is one of the most linguistically diverse, ethnically and linguistically diverse nations, large nations on the land. I mean, there are some nations which have a greater linguistic diversity per kilometer square kind of area, but India, in terms of its extent and the size of its population, certainly presents that kind of challenge. And we can begin by saying that India has some 22 or so scheduled languages, but actually the linguistic diversity is a whole lot more. And because it artificially appears as around two dozen languages, because we take our history from a kind of a documentary history, and we do understand that the documentary world, the print world, sort of created dominant languages of privilege, and consolidated large linguistic fields into single language territories. And we had the linguistic reorganization of states, which remains the bedrock of our democracy even today. But what has changed with the digital, the possibility of the digital, is that we can possibly today move away from the physical infrastructure that mediates language. That is the keyboard primarily, or basically the QWERTY keyboard, right? Or the typefaces and everything, whatever print entails. And being able to do that and work with more dynamic ways of text inputting, whether it be through virtual keyboards or even text to speech. It is possible now that over time, that system, that force that set in motion the creation of dominant languages can dissipate away. It depends on how we are developing, who is in charge of developing technologies, right? So it is very important that we in India, in South Asia, and in such parts of the world where this issue is relevant, that we make a technological intervention whereby we enable the creation of technological infrastructure that allows us to work with multiple languages, easy crossover between languages, which is, and unfortunately, we do not have that. If we look at the state of our archives today, they are mostly, whatever is getting digitized is primarily either in the form of image scans, or if they are getting digitized, the English records are getting digitized. It's not, the Indian language records are not coming into the digitized language, machine readable language areas. So which means it affects the modeling of languages, etc. We need to be able to develop those infrastructure, and that's where the real thrust. We have undertaken some work here at IIT Delhi, specifically where we have now developed a capability of like a plug and play kind of ability to upload a scan and obtain digitized text in a particular language in about 7 or 8 Indian languages, quite reliable OCR. We hope to be, it's now in testing. We hope to be able to release that for greater use very shortly. But more about that maybe when I speak again.
Great. Thanks, Arjun. All three of you really stuck to your time, which is great and unusual for us. Yeah. But before I invite for the next round, in some ways also responding to each other, if there are any pressing comments or questions, I invite them. Otherwise, I can request Maya to. Yeah. I
I
don't
could
I
just-
think we can have like a queue. I mean, we can have a conversation, right?
Sure, sure.
Naveen?
Yeah.
Maya?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what Arjun said about, really getting our hands dirty, right? There's a need to actually make for ourselves and for our context. And the question has always been who would do it. So on the one hand, we have, sort of the National Informatics Center, and you have those sorts of efforts, CDAC, people have been, of course, chipping
Yes.
away at this. But it does seem to be a little troubling that there is also big tech, which is very invested in addressing the next billion users, right? Who are all going to come from India and who are all going to be speaking not English on the internet, right? So there is a commercial application that drives, in a sense, that innovation also. And I think when I was hoping to draw this contour of this digital commons, right, it was outside of the for-profit model in a sense. But I do understand that we are always dealing with state effort, commercial-driven purposes, right, alongside pro bono efforts from people who are doing for themselves. And who is sort of, like, for example, it's a very interesting recent case about they were trying to use a large language model for Tamil. And the argument was, like you mentioned, Arjun, that they didn't have big enough corpora to train the AI, right? The data, the training set wasn't big enough. So what were they using? YouTube. So YouTube videos, right, in Tamil were really the training set that was being used. This is at IIT Madras, right? So now there is a problem here that if we don't have enough corpora, because we haven't got into the digital
Absolutely.
with our own sort of content, literally even the future of AI, etc., is very skewed then, right? If we don't have enough to go by from our own context. So clearly the commons in some sense is feeding into commercial and other applications, but there's also a need to return back to the commons. Like it cannot just be for profit driven and then that's where it goes, So hoping, I don't know if, Nirmala, like what you're thinking of this.
No, I completely agree with you, Maya. And I think that for me, that, as you know very well, for me, that has always been my skepticism, right? And the reason that I stick to institutions is because of that, maybe a kind of, over the years inbuilt skepticism towards, commercial applications as being inevitably the slippery slope to, a profit driven model, partly because of the call or the need for sustainability oftentimes, right? So that is why I feel that we need to find a hybrid sustainable model. Like, for example, when I talk about scholarly publishing, OLH has a very good model, right? So the Open Library for Humanities has a wonderful model from the UK, where they have a buy-in from university libraries. So the university libraries contribute towards the sustainability of the open access platform, and because the libraries buy in, then every content on it is completely open access to everyone, including students across universities as well as the general public. So you have to find kind of hybrid sustainable models. That is number one. Number two, I also think, I mean, having said all that and having had some insight into, say, how the Ministry of Education functions, for example, and I'm sure Arjun also knows this very well, is that, it is not a big ask for the state or the government to give us, to give the funds to set up a certain infrastructure. It is not, an amount that is like, hitting the sky, right? So my question is that why cannot we have a consortium of both private as well as public academic institutions who are invested in building a certain infrastructure, and then, kind of give the seed funding. I'm not saying that, give the funding for it to be sustained over 100 years. Like we used to have the print model, the university press model, like, that we had in the early 20th century. But at least, the seed that would get us started, and then can, find its own sustainable models as we go along. Because if we don't get that input at this point, I think it becomes increasingly difficult for any institution or any individual or, group by themselves to do that. I also want to touch on one more point and then I'll stop. I really agree with what Arjun said about, the corpus of, and you also mentioned about, corpus of Indian languages and to build those OCR models. So that also is oftentimes, and this is not just true of languages, by the way. I have found people using climate models or, transportation models where the databases are imported from, say, a European database to conduct our research. So the primary data that should feed into getting those models, right? That is really infrastructure. That is an infrastructural challenge. That is, and I think that just has to be done in some ways with a, massive kind of input in the beginning. That's my, that's what I feel.
Yeah, so I think quickly responding to this question of having annotated data sets is very, very important. I think one of the things that we did as part of our project is actually create a very reliable large corpus in some of these languages on the bedrock of which these models are getting developed. And the reason why that one seeks to avoid it is creating of the infrastructure is because of lack of expertise. Many of these projects are actually run in various institutions by the engineering
absolutely
sort of without any collaboration or any handshake with the humanities. And that is something to do with our education model. The hiatus between the humanities education and the technology education in India is terrible. I mean, it just doesn't allow any conversation. I mean, engineering education does include humanities, social science courses, but humanities, social science courses never veer towards any kind of technology. So we have a very, very large gap. And that is what is a real challenge before us, because if we do not have the expertise to create that annotated data set, then what we are going to do, we are going to take the shortest route. And that is going to produce unreliable models. And another point that I had in my presentation, but due to lack of time, I did not point out, is that some of these models are now getting implemented to governance sort of technologies. You are predicting certain kinds of behavior, even what Adrian in the chat has talked about, in terms of looking at social media. And so India is a country which has the largest number of internet shutdowns in the world. And I would think it is in part because we do not have good enough language models to be able to pinpoint where specific posts or other things which could be problematic and then address them. Instead of that, you shut down the entire internet services, which has so I think the question is, in the short run, what Nirmala is saying, needs to be a certain kind of infrastructural push, whether it comes from public or private. It needs to think beyond immediate profit, number one. And in the long run, we have to think of a different educational model, which brings together the humanities, social sciences a lot more. My hope is that now that we are going to have school students who are pass outs would have some basic knowledge in coding, it will perhaps become a little easier. But it's one thing to learn coding and then forget about it once you enter your graduation. That's something we have to make sure that the syllabus for the 4-year graduation programs continues to include coding inputs, and the student shouldn't forget it after the 10th or the 12th.
I think the danger there also, Arjun, is that, because of our model of education, that if the humanities students or the humanities voices are not there at the conceptualizations of these new technologies, whether it is AI or related technologies, then, you have already missed the bus a little bit, right? Then you're correcting.
And the gap sort of widens and it becomes more unsurmountable later on. And that's the question.
Yeah.
So can I invite, so Adrian's got a series of comments and questions. I can read it out for the audience while the speakers can have a look at it. So can the government of India require the majority of international journalists working out of India to waive the open access fee for the Indian authors? How does WhatsApp and the like open up the vernacular field that Arjun is talking about? What kind of tools do we need to capture the archive of public expression in social media platforms? And then a little mischievously, will Reliance give access to data centers? Uh, and there is a risk in stamifying the humanities without humanizing the TCT. Yeah, so can I invite responses to this? While, yeah, I could start collecting questions from the others. Yeah.
Well, I'll take the first question, then the others can take the others. Right. So in terms of the first question, I think that let me just look at that question once again. Yeah, can the GUI require the now? First of all, the thing is that the GUI does not have a role here, right? Directly, at least. So what happens is that there was a move, and I think there is, in some ways, at least within the IITs, the librarians of the different IITs come together and negotiate with journals for subscription rates. So I think, for Scopus Index and Web of Science and, some of these databases, there is a kind of a collective negotiation that is done that brings the prices down for our access, right? In terms of publications, it is oftentimes, the funding agencies that drive that. Right. So, for example, I think the director of biotechnology, DBT requires that if you have funding from them, that the publication should be open access. But then the open access APC charges are built into the grant. So that is how it works. So what that means is that, for a majority of our researchers across the country, except in some of these elite institutions, those charges are very, what is the word I'm looking for? It's not affordable. And that is not true for just, I think, Indian institutions. I have known my colleagues in the United States in small state universities who cannot afford to publish in some of the open access journals with their high APC charges, right? So I don't know if the GOI can do anything about it, but I do think that is a much larger question that we should have as academics globally in terms of the publishing stranglehold in some ways of the trade publishing.
Yeah.
So the risk of STEMifying the humanities without humanities.
I think
so actually,
I'll give you the context quickly. We've had a lot. I remember the last dean of our faculty, Humanities and Social Sciences, whose message was STEMify or die, and that meant adding a lot of data skills courses into humanities degrees, usually expecting people to master things in 10 weeks that you used to spend a whole degree on, and adding that onto their additional skills without a move in the other direction. And I think it's a challenge how we put that into the curriculum without diluting the kind of humanities skills, which seem to be the things that are really needed in the partnerships we want to make. So I'm sorry if it's not really a question, it's just, but I'll be interested to know your thoughts, how that works out in India.
My experience is that, the entry points for different streams are different. And so there cannot be a one-stop solution. Some institutions I have found that have tried to address this by creating one single kind of core course for everybody to take. And that is probably not going to be the kind of solution. We need to figure out, it's, in my sense, the entry point is similar to language learning, for example. You can't have a single language learning course for everybody. You try to figure out O-level, A-level, various levels, and then programming or coding is not a one-stop solution. There is some basic coding, but after that, it should be application-based. These are the kind of things that I do. Important thing is that it should be a conversation enabler. So if it comes down to a single core course that everybody has to do, that is going to be a burden on the humanities. As far as humanities inputs in the technology education is concerned, within the IITs, there is a sizable sort of requirement. I mean, at least 10% of the coursework is humanities coursework, and
Humanities.
that has had a significant amount of dividend in the long run, in terms of the alumnus and the fields that they go in, the kind of interventions that they do. I mean, it's not we are not an island in the world, so we cannot sort of solve all the problems. But we do see a large sort of repercussion of the humanities input that is there in the. But unfortunately, many of the private institutions skip that. I mean, where the only bit of humanities that they have is just language learning. That's all. So that's a question mark. But the major engineering colleges in India do have a humanities component, but not the other way around. The major humanities departments or institutions in this country don't have any technology input, and that becomes crucial a limitation in enabling a conversation in these times where it becomes challenging.
There is a follow-up from Priya. Arjun, do you want to engage with that?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, it is actually beyond the Indian context. Yes. So definitely we need to have more conversation. It's not part of, it's on not with three of us have not brought it on the table today, but pedagogy I think is an important conversation. We have been as part of our conversations on digital humanities in this country. We've been talking about pedagogy. So we'd be happy to hear from Priya a little bit more about what she has in mind.
Thanks, Arjun. It's really quite interesting, all your different perspectives, because speaking on from the perspective of Australia India Institute, I guess what we're trying to do is to see where are, in the space of higher education, in what is the facilitating role that, we can put forward, AII can propose, that might be a way that might open the possibility of some kind of collaboration, because that's really one of the things that the Australian Department of Education is interested, and the universities are interested, is increasing the amount of research collaboration between the researchers in higher education. And we have been actually quite active in lobbying the department to expand the scope of engagement and funding for research to include the humanities and social sciences, and one way of doing it has been through this kind of digital, like bringing the digital in. Otherwise it's always STEM, it's nothing else. So we've been lobbying a lot on how they need to expand. So we, this workshop, we're hoping that, there may be some kind of guidance or leads and ideas that might come up, which give us the basis for putting it forward, which can then perhaps be taken up and pursued if the department is convinced. So I'm looking from that perspective at what kinds of things come up from your concerns. I mean, I can see the issue of open issue of open access publishing. Those are some genuine questions, and I know because I'm an editor of a journal that's being published out of India, and we have always maintained it as open access. It's got nothing to do with technology, it's conservation and society. But we've always been open access. We've had some funding before, but now we have to charge some APC, and we've got some, it's dropping off because there's lots of open access publishers now. So we're dealing with a different set of problems.
Challenging, yeah.
That's not the issue. That it's not about what I know, but it's really about what are the areas in the humanities and social sciences that we could potentially see as spaces where we can say, this is potentially something that people could collaborate to do some more research, or at least establish the groundwork for building up some new
If I may
trends.
say this, one of the things that one can think of is doing a joint, it's like an adult education program. So for early career researchers as well as graduate students, we can have basic workshops, kind of a winter school jointly organized, where we both talk of the hack and the yak. That is, we look at critical tools in the digital humanities as well as hands-on tools in the digital humanities, maybe a week-long. That's the way DH has developed in most part of the West. And but we have to collaborate. If we had to collaborate, we have to develop our own pedagogical models as to what the summer school or the winter school would really look like.
One of the things that I would like to see is to do, to get some support for doing a very in-depth bibliometric analysis, of real numbers in terms of journals, publications, print, open access, that come out of India, what is kind of the travel, in terms of where we publish, where other people publish, what are the inputs, I really would, I know it's too ambitious, so I've never really kind of, I've tried to do a small part of it, but that is also something that I would like to have a study on. The Scholarly Kitchen, I think, has come out with an article on the kind of publishing trends in Wiley and two other publishers, I think, in terms of databases. I didn't get the time to go through the article completely because it was published yesterday, I think. But I feel that studies of that sort are also, lacking in the Indian context. Right. So in terms of scholarly publishing. So I would, some kind of bibliometric work also, I think, is necessary.
Before we get into Pradeep's question, Adrian has a follow-up question at the end. How does the maturation of digital archives open up possibilities for research collaborations using these materials? So can you, and the panelists?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. Maya might want to take that.
Actually, I was looking at the language questions earlier.
Yeah, I was also
the social media and the language questions, and I think they're related in a sense because we're talking about capacity. Right? Fundamentally, do we have the capacity to archive in our own sort of historical ways? So there are sort of so many things going on, right? There's a national education policy at play that finally admits that we should be able to study in whatever mother tongue suits that audience. And to think it took so many years to admit the possibility of having this sort of multilingual in the regional languages across India. College, for instance, education. I mean, it's ridiculous that it took so long. And this is for engineering and medicine and, not just in sort of humanities, social sciences sense. So there is a mandate, really speaking, to say that digital inclusion requires multilingual inclusion. And I think we get this, and the companies definitely get it. So in case, I don't know if folks are familiar, but there is something called ShareChat, which is a multilingual social media platform. So I can write in Marathi and it can come out in Kannada, that kind of interface. And the Indian sort of almost equal, I guess, of Twitter, which is now X, right, is something called Ku. And Ku supported the most number of Indian languages early in the game. So much so that Ku actually went really viral in Brazil, because they also gave Portuguese support. So there is a sense in which whatever platform we are building for multilingual will apply to pretty much everything, right? It could be data sets for training AI, it could be archiving, it could be whatever. So I love the way that you phrased it, Pradeep, which is the language justice sort of, framework. And I think that there are enough people now putting their mind to this question, though it's a little, belated, but certainly it is in the room now. And there's another concomitant sort of, I think, shadow, which is that of the commercial application of all of this. And we are well aware of, in that sense, how the early story of, I don't know if everyone's familiar, but the Facebook basic story that, Facebook was trying to give India a fairly filtered version of free internet. and it was opposed on the
Oh,
principle of
absolutely.
neutrality,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That it was a. So what is interesting is that all these years later now, during the pandemic, essentially, Reliance enters into a deal with Facebook, right? And Facebook buys out 10% equity in Reliance. And I'm sorry, I should call it Meta, not Facebook now. That was Basics, now it's Meta. And in the meanwhile, there is this kind of way of leveraging commercial coincident interest. And I just hope, honestly, that with all those brains in the room, that whatever solutions are arrived at, particularly for multilingual support, will also be applicable to other kinds of archiving and the last question about the access to digital archiving specifically that comes from these platforms. Because I think I didn't say it well enough, but my problem statement at the very beginning was that there is no single platform of discovery for this content. So there may be a lot of digitizing efforts across different parts in different languages, but how do you actually get to them has been the challenge. And like Arjun rightly said, we've had a very sort of slow journey and very uneven across Indian languages with that kind of support for OCR, etc. But essentially, we know that big tech will solve that problem for us. We know this. However, how do we get it back into, a public use domain? Yeah,
So
Arjun?
the question is that Pradeep asked an earlier question as to how these language-specific decisions are taken on which repositories are going to be built. See, the public input, I mean, CDAC and all, are going by the assumption of the scheduled languages.
Yeah.
Scheduled languages.
But,
Yes.
but
Yes.
it is, there's a lot more linguistic diversity which is getting addressed outside it through private effort, either through individual researchers who are creating the NLP models for data sets for specific sort of low resource languages. Or I was very surprised. Yesterday, I was fiddling around with Amazon Fire Stick, and I found that it provides Bhojpuri language support. Either you have
That's one.
You have private capital sort of tapping in on a particular, so in multiple ways, but we really do not have it as a kind of a publicly controlled systems are still stuck with the print model of 22 scheduled languages. That's
I think that one of the reasons why.
But it's also kind of that. Oh, sorry.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, just one of the reasons why I asked that question was, I did a little bit of work on the TKDL, the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, right? That was 15 years ago, something. And there are only 5 traditions that are part of it, right? And I've always asked the question, what happens to all the other traditions? Who makes the decision? Who makes the decision to say that? But I think the reason there is because some of these traditions have been monetized. Yoga, for example, is highly monetized, and that could be the reason for it. But language is, of course, different. But still, the question is, who makes the decision?
Can I just paste in the chat, because I found this very interesting. The commercial side of how things are playing out, right? There's one story about Meta, which is doing to language what I guess OpenAI has been doing to LLMs in terms of the commercial face of that. And I just think that we should pay attention to that side of the story, because we are thinking that NLP is very happening in the Indian university system, but it's even more happening in the commercial sort of space of application. So I think to ignore that would be foolhardy. So and also since Jan 23 at the least, Google is by default bilingual in India. So depending on what part of the country you move to when you run a search, like I will get Marathi and English both, always. As a culture, we've always been trilingual, but in this case, I think that bilingual setting has now been kind of
already there.
Baked into it now. It's in the US.
But I also wanted to get back to your point, Maya, about from in the beginning, which is that that what you pointed to about the NEP is also in manifest of the fact that the state is always behind the people, right? In the sense that if you really think about even when I went to college in the 90s, right? If you think about how colleges were run in this country, it was always bilingual. It was always like yes, you wrote your exams in English, but faculty across this country in different colleges have always resorted to pedagogy bilingually. It was almost the norm, right? It just took the state a long time to get to it and make it official, right? So because when you are in a class, even in an institute like an IIT, when you're in a class, and you want a student to understand something, and the best way to get it to him or her is to use a language that,
Correct.
if you are also familiar, you immediately do that, right?
So engineering
in some
classes
ways,
here
it's
have,
typical of how we
yeah,
do things in India, which
yeah,
is, chaotic, unstructured, and then at some point we decide, okay, let's give this a structure, right? So it's kind of a reverse engineering mindset, I guess.
yeah. No, I was thinking about the English as the medium of instruction.
English, yeah,
It's
yeah,
a standard
yeah.
operating option in engineering coaching. So English is Hindi and
Yeah.
English.
It's a creolized form of.
So what that has resulted in our system within at least the IITs is that now the entrance exam is in both in Hindi and English, not in
Yes.
other Indian languages. But the instruction medium and the life going forward is all in English. And that has led to a serious question of hurdle where there are dangers of people dropping out, because you brought in the diversity, but you have not made the pedagogic, institutional, structural changes that will enable and provide a bridge. And so it's one thing to provide a challenge and then say, get people in, but then make it tough for them and let them fend for themselves. So, pedagogy becomes a very important question.
I have to come in now as chair. I mean, it's just 2 minutes left. Can we invite closing comments, 30, 40 seconds before I pass it back to Adrian? That's silence.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to go? Well,
Yeah.
I think it was a great conversation. And I think, the three things that come out to me in the conversation we had was one, the public good, public archives or community archives, access and equity, as well as an infrastructure for multilingual setups. I think those are the three things that I think that all three of us kind of converge on in different ways.
Anything to add, Maya? Thanks.
No, spot on. Absolutely. Access is linked to the languages. So until we go fully multilingual in the digital, we don't provide access. So, yeah.
Sure. Arjun, there is a final question from Laura. I don't know whether we have time, but if you can take it.
I'll try to take that. Thing is that there is both a challenge as well as an opportunity. See, the digital humanities, the development of digital humanities in most Western countries developed on the bedrock of very strong digital transformation, digitization module, program. So, and only after that, you had all the language models training and this and that, and whatever stylometry or whatever thing you talk about. In India, we still haven't really moved to that digital transformation in the Indian languages, which is a challenge. But on the positive side, maybe our digital transformation will look different than the Western digital transformation. And so we have the opportunity to sort of plan that if we actually have these kind of conversations and we develop tools from them, right?
Thanks, Arjun, Nirmala, and Maya. I think we had a fantastic panel. Thanks to three of you, and also some fantastic questions. And I also thank Adrian and the organizers for getting this panel. Yeah. Over to you, Adrian.